Well, good afternoon. I'm Tom Farr. I teach at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service and am a visiting senior fellow at the Berkley Center on Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which is co-sponsoring this event. For those of you who weren't here in the morning, this is the second of three symposia. The first in February looked at the origins and the promise of our international religious freedom policy. Today we're looking at the implementation of that policy over the last 10 years, and then we invite you all to come back in October, on October 10th, here at Georgetown for the third of our three symposia, which will look forward, look into the future, and provide some policy recommendations based on what we're hearing today and what we had in February and what we have in October. We will provide policy recommendations to the new administration on U.S. international religious freedom policy. We heard this morning from three of the excellent practitioners of America's religious freedom policy. I thought it was a vigorous discussion. We're going to now turn to the scholars of American foreign policy. We're going to ask them to engage some of the same problems that you heard discussed this morning, but from a very different window. And indeed, I would say for these three, ladies and gentlemen, three very different windows themselves as they look at this issue. I've asked these three people, whom I will introduce in just a minute, to look at three or four questions. The first one is, why has your profession, and I might say my own, not paid very much attention to religion in international affairs, and partly as a result, not very much attention to religious freedom in American foreign policy? Secondly, I've asked each of them to give their own critique of what the United States has done in the last 10 years with this policy, and to muse a little bit with us out loud about that. And then to talk a little bit about the future. How might reconfigurations of our international religious freedom policy make a greater contribution to some of the things you heard discussed this morning, particularly Will Inboden's discussion of democracy promotion and the issue of religion-based extremism. Is religious freedom a destabilizing presence? Is it the skunk at the garden party, so to speak, on these issues? Or can it lend a kind of stability to American foreign policy, either in the way we are doing it now, or perhaps by dint of improvements to that policy in the future? I cannot tell you how delighted I am to have these three individuals. Those of you who have read our program know that we initially had four. Walter Russell Mead on the Council on Foreign Relations has been unable to join us because the city of New York, in its wisdom, decided that he would better serve the country on jury duty. And so he had to go this morning in New York and couldn't be here. However, I am, as I say, delighted to introduce to you. I will introduce the three speakers in the sequence in which they will give their remarks to you, and ask them to come up then in that order. First, to my left is Joshua Muravchik, who is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, who specializes in the study of democracy, human rights, and the role of ideology in international politics. At AEI, Dr. Muravchik studies the United Nations, neoconservatism, on which he is an expert, the history of socialism and communism, on which he is also an expert, but from a different point of view, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and global democracy, terrorism, and the Bush Doctrine. His most recent book is The Future of the United Nations, Understanding the Past to Chart a Way Forward. Dr. Muravchik is completing a book at the present time, probably while he is sitting here, a book of portraits of Middle Eastern Democrats that will be published early next year. He currently serves as a member of the State Department's Advisory Committee on Democracy Promotion, is an adjunct scholar at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics here in Washington. His writings appear often in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Commentary Magazine, and numerous other newspapers, magazines, and journals. To Josh's left is Philip Gordon, who is Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, where he has worked since 2000. Prior to coming to Brookings, he was Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council under President Bill Clinton. He has held other teaching and research posts, such as at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies here in Washington. Dr. Gordon is a regular commentator in international affairs and U.S. foreign policy for major television and radio networks, and a frequent contributor to the op-ed pages of major publications such as the New York Times, Washington Post, International Herald Tribune, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, and Le Monde. He is the author and co-author of a number of books, most recently including Winning the Right War, The Path to Security for America and the World. His most recent articles include in the November-December issue of Foreign Affairs, Can the War on Terror Be Won? Dr. Gordon is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the board of the U.S. Committee on NATO, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He is currently a foreign policy advisor to Senator Barack Obama. And last but certainly not least is Ruth Wedgwood, who is the Edward Burling Professor of International Law and Diplomacy and Director of the Program on International Organizations at Law at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. At Johns Hopkins and at Yale, where she was previously a professor at law, Dr. Wedgwood has taught public international law, international human rights law, humanitarian law, and arbitration, foreign affairs power, constitutional law, and American legal history. During the course of her remarkable career, Dr. Wedgwood has served as a visiting professor at the University of Paris, a prize fellow of the Berlin Academy, and co-director of studies for the Hague Academy of International Law in the Peace Palace at The Hague. She has directed the program on international organizations at law at the Council on Foreign Relations, and in 2002 was elected by 148 state parties as the U.S. member of the United Nations Human Rights Committee in Geneva. Professor Wedgwood has served on the U.S. Secretary of State's Advisory Committee on International Law and was appointed as an independent expert on war crimes law by the President of the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. She's a director of Freedom House and a member of the American Law Institute, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you would greet all three of our panelists, and we will begin with Dr. Muravchik.
Thank you very much, Tom, and I'm delighted to be here. Tom gave us general guidance with some 4 questions, and he said to me, do your best to address these 4 questions. The 4 questions, I kind of laughed, an in-joke to myself. This is Passover, and the Passover holiday is intended mostly as a way of teaching our history to our children, and the center of the Passover ceremony is the 4 questions, which the youngest child asks, and they have to do with why we eat matzah and bitter herbs on this occasion. I don't know if those questions are tougher than the ones that Tom has put to me, but I will do my best to address his. Although I basically have 2 points I want to make in response to the 4 questions. One about the academic neglect of this topic, and the other about the relevance of this topic to U.S. strategies. As far as the neglect of this topic, well, I received my PhD here at Georgetown University in international relations. When I was studying international relations, we had just in that field reached the end of an era in which international relations as an academic discipline was dominated by the ideas that we call realism, which the standard introductory textbook in the field was the book of Hans Morgenthau, Power Among Nations. And in that book, you can read the thought which sums it up, which is, and I'm quoting roughly, but I'm quoting from memory, so I won't be exactly right, that politics operates according to laws which are impervious to our wishes. This is the central idea of realism, which is that politics somehow, and particularly politics among nations, derives from imperatives that grow out of the size and geographic positions of the various states. And each state has its innate interests arising from its size and geographic position. And therefore, nothing that any of the human beings who reside within that state thinks is of any impact whatsoever. If you believe that, then it's quite apparent why you don't think that how these individuals worship or how intensely they worship is any matter whatsoever. Behaviorism, realism dominated the field for a couple of decades, and then when I was a student had just been sort of elbowed aside by behaviorism, which is a school of thought in all the social sciences, which it was a useful criticism of realism in that it was empirical, whereas Morgenthau didn't ever quite explain where these laws came from. But the problem with realism, with behaviorism, with its emphasis on empiricism, was that it was aimed to make the study of international relations as rigorous as the study of physics or chemistry, and therefore was interested in focusing on areas in which you could do experiments and count things. And if your framework for studying politics is things you can count, then I think you're likely to pay a limited amount of attention at most to how people worship or what they worship or how intensely. Now, you can, of course, count how many Christians and Jews and Muslims there are. There's some things you can count, but in my view, you probably can't readily count some of the most important things. And then to top this off, there's been, I think, a neglect of this subject because I haven't counted, I don't have any data, but I feel extremely confident in saying that the largest number of academics in this field are themselves agnostics or atheists or people who are not, for whom religious faith is not a very central part of their lives. I think probably your prototypical academic in this field, or probably in most of the social sciences, is someone whose feelings about religion were encapsulated in that recent, much quoted remark of the presidential candidate whom Phil is advising, that people cling to belief because the system is not solving their economic concerns. And this is a kind of sad, desperate thing that people do. They cling to their guns and their religion because we have not had rapid enough increases in the minimum wage and Social Security and Medicare benefits. I dare say that most devout people probably do not think that that's why they are devout, or are unaware that their sense of religious devotion is in fact a displaced yearning for a higher minimum wage. But I think the opinion that is really what's going on is not something unique to Barack Obama, not a slip of the tongue of Barack Obama's, but it is the prevailing view among a large part of the American elite, including, I think, a great many academics. So those are some thoughts about why this subject has been neglected. The second point I want to make has to do with the relevance of this strategically to U.S. objectives or foreign policies, to the war on terror, et cetera. And I think it's potentially extremely important because it, I think, gives us a way to have a dialogue and have a discussion with the Muslim world, which is otherwise we don't have many ways to enter into it. By that I mean, I think that there's a deeper problem in the problem of terrorism than is commonly acknowledged by President Bush or other officials, because they don't want to give offense. And so the official mantra is that the terrorists are a tiny minority who have hijacked a religion of peace. And this is not entirely accurate, in that the terrorists, or the people who support the terrorists, are not a tiny minority. They are a minority. I think we have lots of evidence that they're a minority, but the same evidence shows us that they're not so tiny, depending on what you would call tiny, but we have public opinion polls in the Muslim countries that show that 8, 10, 15%, sometimes 20 or more percent of the publics in these societies, in fact, support suicide bombing, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, the whole 9 yards. And we also have the behavior of the governments, in which, to this day in the UN, the treaty that would categorically condemn terrorism is blocked. It has been blocked for 10 years because the Islamic states refuse to support any treaty that categorically condemns terrorism, that without an exception for terrorism on behalf of national liberation, terrorism against occupation, and so, which they all say is good and righteous and should not be called terrorism. And that remains the position of the Organization of the Islamic Conference. And so the point here is that that there is some public, some constituency for terrorism in the Muslim world. And I think that there are no doubt many sources of that, but that, and many are historical and political and so on, but they also, there is also a source in the the idea that's strong in Islam that people who are not Muslim are in some way defective. And this is, of course, a problem that's not unique to Islam. All religions have to believe that theirs is the one true God or true understanding of God, and that others who don't share that understanding are wrong, and that the world would be better if they got it right. But the question then is what you do about it. And but this idea that people who are not within the faith are defective, I think, is especially strong in Islam as kind of the flip side for something that I think, as an outsider, is very beautiful in Islam, which is its emphasis on unity, the oneness of God and man, and the oneness of the human race, which is a beautiful idea, but it makes it harder to grapple with the fact that there are some people who are not members of the faith. And I think that in the long term, that our battle against terrorism is not going to be won militarily, but is going to be won when the idea of flying an airplane into a building seems as outlandish and impermissible to 99% of the publics of the Islamic world as it seems, I would suppose, to 99% of the publics of the Western world. And I think that what we would hope to see to bring that about would be some kind of crystallization of thought within the Muslim world about these issues, not just terrorism, but also the deeper issue of finding a theological basis to accept pluralism. And the huge handicap we have in trying to engineer any of this is that it's very hard for us who are we who are non-Muslims to enter into any kind of discourse within the Muslim world. Pretty much we can't do that. But I think that the issue of freedom of religion gives us the best avenue that we may have to discuss, we who are non-Muslims, to discuss with Muslims and to try to influence their thinking, because on this one issue, we have some standing to argue if it has to do with their acceptance or rejection of us. And I think that one of the most interesting and hopeful developments, to my mind, of the last few months has been the call by King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia for an interfaith dialogue. This in itself seems to me to be a huge leap. Saudi Arabia is a country which has so much as at its center the idea of exclusivity in Islam, that you can't build a house of worship or even bring in a religious article or prayer book of another faith into the country unless you sneak it in. And non-Muslims cannot visit Mecca and Medina. And so it has really been the very bastion of this kind of exclusivist strain within Islam. And for the king of Saudi Arabia, whose authority and dignity rests on not his title as king of Saudi Arabia, but his title as custodian of the two holy cities, to say, let's have an interfaith dialogue, is something quite remarkable and quite hopeful.
Well, good morning, and let me begin by thanking Tom for inviting me here and congratulating him on pulling this important forum together. Also note, as Josh did, he made it easy for us by sort of giving us the questions we were to address. And like Josh, I'd like to actually follow the instructions. Beginning with the first one, which is addressing this issue of why it is that international relations scholars haven't paid a whole lot of attention to religion. And what I would say about that to begin is that I accept the premise. Indeed, I may even embody the premise because I am probably guilty myself of not thinking enough about the role of religion in international affairs. And so the question got me to thinking, why is that? As I say, I confirm the presence. Josh related doing his PhD at Georgetown. I did mine some 20 years ago at SAIS, and I can tell you I don't remember a whole lot of discussion of religion or courses on religion. Ruth will tell us if it's different now because she's teaching there, but it just wasn't what you focused on in your international relations courses. Now, to be fair, I mostly was focusing on Europe then, so it was probably appropriate that religion was not a central focus of coursework, but I also did courses in the Middle East and international relations theory, and it just wasn't a central issue. Josh mentions Morgenthau, but think of all of the classics, Man, the State and War, and Bob Cohen and George Kennan, and they're not about religion. What we've said so far is sort of anecdotal. John Micklethwaite, this is also anecdotal, but it gets a little bit more scientific. Micklethwaite is the editor of The Economist. You may have read the interesting survey of religion he did 6 months or so ago, in which he reminds us that in Henry Kissinger's Diplomacy, that magisterial 800-page tome on international relations, the word religion isn't in the index. And here's a book that surveys hundreds of years of foreign policy, diplomacy, relations among states, internal factors that affect foreign policy, and it just doesn't come up, which is kind of telling, I think, of the point. Somewhat more scientifically, Micklethwaite notes, and I don't know where he found this study, but a study of 4 leading journals of international affairs in the period from 1980 to 1999. And during that period, in all of those magazines, which come out monthly or quarterly, only half a dozen articles in that 20-year period focused on or dealt with religion. Now, I suspect that has probably changed since that study ended in 1999. I think now you would see more foreign affairs, just to name one, including Walter's good article not too long ago. But nonetheless, the point is confirmed. The basic schools of international relations theory have just not been interested in religion. Realists focus on power and states and assume a desire for power and security, and they don't think about individual beliefs. Liberal internationalists also focus on individuals, but just make an assumption that individuals want prosperity and freedom, and their natural state is cooperation, and they're not interested in what they may believe in terms of religion. Neoconservatives, I would say, insist that all people can benefit from freedom and democracy if given the chance, and to the extent that they focus on religion, it is mostly in the notion that fundamentalist Islam results from the lack of freedom, all the more reason, they would argue, to use American power to promote democracy. I think the only school of international relations theory that really has taken religion seriously has been Marxism. Josh knows more about this than I do, but Marxists talked about religion, but they saw it as a tool for suppressing class consciousness. So at least they thought about it, but not, but in that mostly narrow way. I would say that another reason that religion, or a main reason that religion hasn't been the focus of these schools of international relations or diplomacy, is that it hasn't been, for a few hundred years now, the main cause of war and peace. And war and peace has been the main focus of these schools of thought. I mean, that's what you're trained to study when you do international relations. And that's what Henry Kissinger writes a book about diplomacy. He's most interested in war and peace. And I think it is actually fair to say that since the 17th century, religion hasn't been the dominant factor in war and peace, and therefore it's appropriate that these schools, at least until recently, haven't focused on that. I don't want to do a potted history of the past 4 centuries and do violence to that history, but I think you can broadly say that the 18th century was dominated by monarchs and states, and these monarchs may have had religious affiliations, but that they were interested in power and glory. They weren't interested in religion as the driving factor for their international behavior. The United States is an interesting exception in the late 18th century to that rule, where religion was important, and in a country founded in many ways by people escaping from constraints on religious freedom. I think that's relevant to this entire discussion that gets us into the International Religious Freedom Act, because it helps explain why the United States is different from most of these other countries. But in the 18th century, religion wasn't the dominant factor in their foreign policies. In the 19th century, nationalism becomes the issue, and state building, and conflict is defined more about nations competing with each other, but in a secular way and not in a religious one. And the 20th century, again, you have secular ideologies as the main fault line in the international system. The capitalist West wasn't driven by religion, and certainly the atheist communist East wasn't either. And so I would say, again, by just in that glossing over all sorts of complicated things in that way, that it's not surprising that scholars of diplomacy and international relations haven't focused on religion, because it wasn't, in fact, the driving force. That may be changing, as is the neglect from scholars of international affairs of religion. Different scholars date this to a different time, but it's probably fair to say that starting in the 1970s, religious consciousness around the world rose, but more importantly, it started to affect politics. And this is true in many ways we won't get into in great detail here. People refer to resistance to communism, the election of a Polish pope in 1978, the way in which people in Eastern Europe could turn to the church as the one place where they would be allowed to practice their religious beliefs, in part as a function of their anti-communism, but I think even more to the extent that we're talking about how this affects international affairs, we need to think about the Middle East, where the rise in religious belief and the importance of religion as a political factor emerges from the failure of secular nationalism starting in the 1960s, where in the post-colonial period, the Middle Eastern states were dominated by secular nationalism, and that was meant to liberate people and provide for a better life. And it clearly failed to do so, the 1967 war being a turning point, showing the failure of these secular nationalist Arab states and raising the question of, was there not a better path to the future? And for many, the answer, the better path, turned out to be religion, in that case, Islam. So this may be changing, but those are, it seems to me, some of the reasons why it has largely been neglected by most people who think about war, peace, and international affairs. Now, the second question we were asked was to think about the International Religious Freedom Act 10 years later and provide a critique of it, and that's what I would like to do as frankly as possible. The first thing I would say in that context is it seems to me altogether natural that the United States ended up producing an act like this. As I alluded to before, you have a country founded on the notion of protecting religious freedom that goes to the core of the beliefs of many Americans, combined with a natural and historic tendency to want to enlighten others since the start of the Republic, wanting to bring enlightenment to others, wanting to bring democracy to others. And you put those things together, and let me just say it's hardly surprising that eventually it was the United States that decided to have an act of law that was designed to promote religious freedom. How do we judge the effects of that 10 years later? I think others are better placed than I am to discuss the degree to which it has actually, and the first panel got into that a bit as well, succeeded in promoting religious freedom. I think even among those who have practiced and tried to implement the act, there's a lot of frustration at the lack of progress in doing so. But I would like to suggest, whatever one's judgment of that, some of the problems that remain and I think they're quite similar to those that were raised when the Act was first imagined more than 10 years ago. And let me just mention 3 issues that I think are worthy of our consideration. One is the question of whether when you have you create a specific act of law in a bureaucracy to promote one right, does that not suggest a sort of hierarchy of rights and raise questions about why you're not doing the same thing on those other rights as well? Because Americans, as devoted as they are to religious freedom, are also devoted to many other rights, minority rights, press freedom, women's rights. We could create a very long list. And I think one of the critiques of the Act when it was passed is still relevant today. How do we balance these very important freedoms, and how do we, if you're going to create a special act of law and bureaucracy and ambassador for one, how does that fit in with the rest of U.S. foreign policy? A second critique, I think, is still relevant today. Actually, indeed, it's more relevant today than when the Act was passed, is the concern that the Act reinforces the stereotype of the United States as a hectoring, moralistic, and even imperialistic country. Again, that's something that was heard a lot at the time. Already in the Clinton years, the United States was increasingly seen this way. But I think 10 years later, the concern is even greater. And this is always a concern when the United States stands up in the world and takes a strong position on moral or any other issues. But it's even truer now when U.S. reputation in the world is at a low point compared to past decades. When the U.S. itself is criticized for its human rights practices, fairly or unfairly, it makes it all the more difficult for the United States to judge others on similar issues. And then the third, and I think related but also important critique, is the question of the United States as an honest broker. We may feel, as we seek to promote religious freedom around the world, that we are doing so for the benefit of all in the most unbiased way, and that may even be true. But it's not necessarily the way that the Act and the policy is perceived in other parts of the world. And so you have this challenge or the problem that naturally in the United States there are some religions that are more dominant than others, and for many on the receiving end of the U.S. efforts to promote religious freedom, there's the question of relative influence and who gets to actually be the arbiter in terms of what gets promoted. So I think all of those things, they were raised at the time, and they are worth continued consideration as we decide about the next decade of work in this area, because they haven't gone away, and as I said before, in some cases they're even more relevant now than previously. Let me offer just a few comments before concluding on the third set of issues. We had 2 separate questions on how this fits into U.S. foreign policy more broadly, how it fits into democracy promotion and efforts to transform the Middle East, and how it fits into the war on terrorism. And I'll sort of take those together in terms of the Act and U.S. foreign policy broadly. My overall theme on that point, I guess, is we should be careful not to overburden this Act and the important principle of promoting religious freedom with too many broad foreign policy goals. I think there's been a tendency in the United States, especially since 9/11, no doubt well before that on other issues, but especially since 9/11, that whatever good thing you're interested in, you can sell it much better if you put it in the context of the war on terror. And so, if you're interested in poverty, then you say that we should be seeking to alleviate poverty because that's part of the great campaign to win the war on terror. In many cases, there's something to that, but I think we should be careful not to oversell what we're trying to do in the world, always in this context. And I say that because I actually think promoting religious freedom is a good thing that can and should be sold on its merits, and not oversold by folding it too greatly into the way we know we can sell it, which is by linking it to the war on terror. That's obviously a complicated thing that we could talk about. We could have an entire other conference on that. I think what is true is that in the long run, there are many factors behind the rise of Islamist extremism and terrorism. What is true is that if we could find ways to alleviate the repression and anger and resentment and humiliation in much of the Arab world, then we would make some headway in dealing with the terrorist problem. I think that is an accurate observation, and it's been at the heart of the Bush foreign policy. The question, however, is whether this correlation between religious freedom and democracy and human rights and all of the things that we think would help alleviate that resentment and anger, whether the correlation works in that direction, or whether, in fact, the reason that religious freedom correlates highly with other freedoms is because it is in generally free and democratic countries that religion can be practiced more freely. So there's clearly a role and a link, but I think it shouldn't be overstated, and we should be realistic about it. Promoting religious freedom is an important goal, and the International Religious Freedom Act, I think, should be best judged 10 years later and 10 years moving forward on its ability to achieve that goal, rather than suggesting that somehow it is a central tool in U.S. foreign policy more broadly. Why don't I end with that and look forward to the discussion.
I actually spend a fair amount of my time doing the things that touch on religion, because I wander away from SAIS, I'm not telling my dean where I am, for 9 weeks a year, to Geneva and New York, where we do sit and administer this little funny international covenant on civil and political rights, which the U.S. joined, actually, under Papa Bush, believe it or not, in 1992. And among its articles, Article 18, Article 19, are articles about freedom of thought, and Article 18, freedom of conscience and religion, including the right to have or adopt a religion or belief of your choice, individually or in community with others, in public or private, to manifest religion and belief in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. So actually, at least in my hobby work as a human rights person, we do from time to time get cases of religious issue, more frequently from countries that have joined the covenant, which typically are European countries. So joined the covenant's so-called optional protocol, which is the right to bring an individual complaint or case. And typically those are European countries. But sometimes from the stands. You'd be amazed what countries do. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, they sign up for stuff not knowing what its consequences may ultimately be, and are often quite surprised and dismayed. But let me go back to what I'm supposed to do first. On why we don't study this stuff at all kind of reasons. I do agree, behaviorism. I used to be pals with Jerome Bruner at NYU Law School, who was the recherche psychologist who tried to re-inject the issue of mind into psychology instead of just counting behaviors. And he was considered quite unscientific and literary for a long time for having done so. So if God has something to do with one's apprehension of mind, then I can see why he's out of the picture. And secondly, I do think that clearly the 20th century in Western history has been the history of ideology, fascism and nationalism and communism. You can count them as religions if you must, but they were substitutes for religion, and they were equally enveloping to the people who were seduced by them. Probably more destructive than religion has been for at least quite some time, but hardly a space for worrying about degrees of Protestantism when you're worrying about major cataclysmic social movements that envelop tens of millions of people. Third, I think it's just us. We're so proud of our liberalism, and it was really quite hard fought. If you go back into American constitutional history, as I was mentioning to the chairman in my little written submission, now we're quite an establishmentarianism country for some time. The Congregationalist Church in the state of Connecticut didn't get disestablished till about 1819, 1820. And the history of why people emigrated to different states has a lot to do with religion. Presbyterians were happy in New Jersey, Episcopalians like North Carolina and South Carolina, Congregationalists like Connecticut, nobody liked the Quakers. Jews kind of scattered around. But if you look at where the First Amendment comes from, it is indeed that religious schism and intolerance was very much afoot in the early days of the Republic, and the First Amendment was really an agreement just to let the states deal with it and not deal with it ourselves at a national level. We weren't going to have a national church, even if we might have, at the time, state churches. So I think, frankly, the evolution of 20th century open, tolerant, inclusive space is perhaps more delicate a phenomenon than one wishes to acknowledge, and therefore perhaps a reluctance to revisit these issues, even if you're projecting the topics abroad. Fourth, I think, frankly, that religion so often maps onto ethnicity. Why do Hindus and Muslims kill each other during the partition of India? You can call it religion, you can call it family, you can call it language, you can call it ethnicity, but there are surrogates that you can use to talk about this, or even Ireland. It's class, it's geographic origin. But fifth, I'll just say, I do think that a lot of the actual impulse behind liberal American foreign policy now is religious. La mission civilitrice. Sometimes it's annoying. It's the Europeans with their like-minded caucus telling us that they are the only group of people who have human values in mind. But certainly the interest in human trafficking, in peonage, in the oppression of women, in freedom of thought itself are all impulses that come from a sense of there being a free human spirit which has to be cultivated and protected. So I will call that religious, if I may. Now, why should we be interested in this kind of stuff? It's certainly now at the foundation of the misunderstanding of civilizations. I don't want to call it the conflict of civilizations. And here there's lots of to my mind, lots of moral responsibility. In many quarters, I have continuingly been critical of what I take to be the arrogance of my European friends toward the Islamic world. It just pains them to think that Aristotle got preserved by Islamic scholars. It pains them to think that Averroes could have been on a par with Thomas and Isidore of Seville. They really don't want to suppose that there was ever anything as an elegant, intellectual Islamic civilization, and we don't know enough about it to be able to do modal logic in Arabic to really appreciate the kind of erudition that Islamic scholars had, certainly in the 12th century, and probably had far later than we realize. And Timbuktu has not yet been digitalized, so one can't fully appreciate the kind of niceties of text and parsing that might be present in the texts there. And secondly, even with La Mission Civilitrice of the European Union, someone so holy, to my mind, as Robert Badinter. You know this guy? Badinter? He's a Holocaust survivor. He was the president of the Conseil Constitutionnel of France, really their equivalent of the Supreme Court. The great crusader against the death penalty. He was very much involved in the attempt to bring peace in Bosnia, although I think he botched it a bit. But even he, a man so wonderful as he, said, Turkey never. Europe is Christian, or Europe is at least not Arab or Turkish. And that kind of arrogance, that exclusiveness, so you don't need Charles Martel wielding a sword to tell people across the Med that you don't regard them as fully capable of being your interlocutor. So I do think that if you want to figure out why there is now a fight over religion, it's not just Al-Qaeda and the Salafists and the timidity of moderate Muslims, but it's also the truly palpable physical smugness of Europeans, and perhaps Americans too, but Europeans certainly in the most immediate neighborhood of this kind of confrontation. On how you treat it, I'm violating your questions, Mr. Chairman, I apologize. This is very tricky stuff, I have to say. And as a good intermarried, product of an intermarriage, Unitarian, ethical, Jewish, Episcopalian person, one searches for spaces where you can fit all the parts of your personality. I've been to all of them. But it's not that way in Europe. It really isn't. I mean, in Bavaria, there is going to be a cross on the classroom wall. There is a national church in Sweden and Holland. It's interwoven with the royalty. So if you try to create this utterly deracinated space, it doesn't feel familiar to people. It really goes to the root of their nationality. Certainly all the Orthodox churches, the Serb Orthodox Church and the Macedonian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. And hell, I knew communism was a goner when I went to St. Isaac's Cathedral in 1986 and realized the Russians were just worshiping standing up, because that's how they do it. They could call it a museum of religion if they wanted, but they were quite visibly moved by the icons on the wall. So I do think that this idea that you could easily turn all of this into simply geometric space in which you infuse your personal pleasures and predilections it may be American, but it's not the way the rest of the world sees ontological space. And therefore, if you're going to talk about freedom of religion, you can't talk about it in quite this deracinated way. It's also complicated, I think, because so often it maps onto really bloody issues of power sharing. Druze and Maronites and Shia and Sunni in Lebanon, good luck. Lawyers are made mock of appropriately because of their belief that if you only have an intricate enough constitution in Cyprus or Lebanon, it's going to last more than a year and a half before the power sharing breaks down, and it doesn't. So if you talk about religion, you're talking about very, very serious social and ethnic and divisions and ambitions. So to have any kind of fatuous discussion about how you should create this much space for that group, I think can often, in the context of a particular society, be seen as something that disrupts a very, very delicate balance of power. Third is just the problem of coded speech. We've had a couple of cases come up in the Human Rights Committee in Geneva. We have one now, actually. Well, not sure if I'm supposed to tell you. In which you have issues that on an American campus would seem utterly benign. Can you can you have preaching about the nature of the ulama and the dima and al-darb and al-islam and the nature of jihad, and allow that to circulate freely? Well, it depends oftentimes, in their view, in Central Asia, who's doing the circulating. And there is a belief that you can use religious speech as a coded method of exhortation to violence, and that what to a Unitarian sounds perfectly fine and interesting, in the context of a Central Asian university may be seen as a way of organizing politically, of displacing the traditional moderate tradition of Central Asian Islam, of having Wahhabist money flow in. And Fred Starr told a funny story. He's our guy who runs our Central Asia Institute at SAIS. He was visiting in some town in either Tajikistan or Uzbekistan, and the mayor was gone for a week, and a prefab mosque was flown in from Saudi and put up, and it was too late to take it down because it was already up. But the worry was that you could really easily change the ecology of thought and tolerance in societies if you were naive about what speech meant in a particular setting. Speech is contextual. So as you come in from the outside saying, oh, you must never allow any prohibition on naqib or hijab, face covering, hair covering, you must never allow any restriction of what seems like abstract political speech or religious speech to you. I am increasingly chastened about how little I may understand of what it means in the context. I will say also one thing that's interesting finally on the issues of adaptation. People do worry that the reservation that most countries that are Muslim take to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, namely that they can't abide anything that trumps Sharia, that Sharia has to be supreme, that admits of more interesting use than one might suppose, because with ijtihad, this kind of principle of reasonableness and evolution and translation, with the Summa and the both sayings and the behavior of the Prophet and the fact that the Prophet had a female judge can be used for analogous reasoning. You can be openly faithful to the ideal of Sharia and still, in fact, have very interesting discourse on what it means in practice. My three Islamic colleagues on the Human Rights Committee will engage in long discourses in Arabic about female genital mutilation and why it's not consistent with Sharia, using all the casuistic tools at their at their disposal. But on the U.S., I think we do have to be somewhat careful because in the Muslim world, freedom of religion is often seen as creating the space for crusade. And Islam feels, I think, beleaguered enough that our secular space is their Christian space. At the same time, there are enough really tendentious totalitarian societies around the world. Even my little friend Lukashenko, who looks like Meatball on All in the Family, will not allow any irregular, innovative, evangelical, unestablished religion to function at all. No Scientologists, no Mormons, no anything that's new. In fact, Europe in general is intolerant of new religions. They do see religions as having to have established social moorings and foundations and longevity over time to be able to be tolerated. So in that sense, certainly in dealing with a reasonably like-minded liberal society, insisting that people do have a right to make their own approach to ontological issues and don't have to simply function through established social groups is something I think we can be very much more forward-leaning on. But I would be careful in other societies. Yes, you want to return the... I'll stop here, Mr. Chairman, but it would be lovely to return Mediterranean Islamic societies to the extraordinary heterogeneity they used to enjoy. You know, Maimonides' temple in Cairo, and the mixture in Morocco, and indeed, in 1994, I had this imaginary moment when I thought that Henry Sigmund was going to create the new diaspora of Jews across North Africa. But clearly, these used to be very, very heterodox societies, and one can remind them of their own history and what they were until so recently, until 48 or 67. But at the same time, be deeply concerned that if one says it in the wrong way, it will to them appear to be another attempt of Europe and North America to be tendentious, of Christianity to claim superiority. And therefore, I think the first step probably is to have a certain self-abnegating approach in doing all of this. Thank you.
All three of our panelists. I was doing a little bit of an experiment of my own in this panel, and a little of my own internal research. I told each of the panelists that I was going to sort of put them into a category of thinker, and I didn't really introduce them as such, except in an implicit sense. None of them complained about my categorization, or at least as I emailed with them, and I'll give them an opportunity to counter this, but let me give you the results of my own little thought experiment. I think Joshua Muravchik is a neoconservative. I think Phil Gordon is probably a liberal internationalist. And I think Ruth Wedgwood is probably representative of realism broadly construed, although she is certainly an internationalist. And I will let each of them argue against that in just a minute. But let me tell you why I think that's important. First of all, I think it gave a very interesting balance to their comments on U.S. engagement with religion writ large, as well as America's international religious freedom policy. Each of them, as Phil Gordon said, bought the premise. They each agreed that for varying reasons, their fraternity or sorority has not paid much attention to this issue. And we heard blamed for this, realism, behavioralism, liberalism to a certain extent, the fact that religion has not, until very recently, been a source of war and peace. We heard that Henry Kissinger's magnum opus, Diplomacy, did not have religion in the index, which I think is a terribly interesting and revealing datum. And yet, when it came to the religious freedom policy of the United States and what they thought about it, we heard from Phil and Ruth, the ones that I am suggesting maybe are liberal internationalists and realists respectively, skepticism about that policy, a little less so on the part of Josh Muravchik. So, I'm not sure I've characterized their views correctly. We'll give them equal time. I'm going to let you ask questions, but first, I have one for each of them. I'm not going to impose them on them now. I'm going to start with Josh, though. I'll ask my question of Josh and then fold the others in as we go. First of all, you have equal time to deny that you're a neoconservative if you'd like. But it sometimes appears that neoconservatives that are thought to have been behind the Bush doctrine seem to ignore the religious motivations of the Iraqi people as our pre-war planning took place. Now, we heard in an earlier panel from Will Inboden, who had served for a while on the National Security Council staff. He quoted from the, I believe it was the 2006 National Security Strategy, in which the Bush administration said that it sought to empower moderate Muslims to interpret their own religion as a way to fight the war on terrorism. And yet, he also pointed out that the Bush administration really didn't spend a dollar in its foreign aid or its democracy promotion programs to integrate religious freedom into the democracy promotion effort. What do you think about that, Josh? Is there a disconnect within neoconservatism on this issue, and is that reflected in Bush policy?
I think there are a lot of other people out there who are being called neoconservatives or calling themselves that, whom I have my doubts about. But I am for sure one. I think that to say that the Bush administration severely underestimated the salience of religion in Iraqi politics is true, but I think it's part and parcel of a much bigger failure to apprehend Iraqi society and what it would take to achieve the goal that the administration had in mind for Iraq, to recreate it as a kind of modeled democracy for the region. And was that because I do kind of object to using neoconservative synonymously with the Bush administration. There's certainly a lot of what the Bush administration did bore the earmarks of neoconservatism, but there were more people working away in the administration who are not or didn't know they were neocons by far than people that you could identify as neocons. But I think to some degree it may have been that the Iraqis that we were talking to before 2003 were themselves an unrepresentative group of Iraqis. That is, there was Chalabi, but there were others as well. There was Kanan Makia, and there was a group of Iraqi exiles. And I think the ones that people in the Bush administration, or that all of us who work in this world knew and had as interlocutors, were people who were liberals or presented themselves to us as liberals. And so it perhaps did not help the administration to focus on this. But clearly there was a very broad feeling. There was the sort of fantasy that the Iraqis would be so ecstatic to be liberated from Saddam that everything else would just sort of fall into place. And that was a horrible mistake. I'd say much the same about the second point, which is the broader point of U.S. strategy for encouraging democratization in the region. This was, I think policy often works this way. But this was a big idea, and Bush grabbed it. Said, "Okay, this is going to be our policy." No one initially had any idea how to implement that policy, and there were not agencies of the government. There was not personnel in the government who had experience or knowledge of that. The one thing we had was a team of people in the government who had been in the previous government who knew how to invade Iraq. They had done that before. And so that was sort of the easy first step to do, but when it turned out not to be so easy. But I think there was not only a neglect of directing some of the resources toward this issue of religious freedom, but I, to this day, find it sort of mysterious where lots of the resources went. I certainly am in touch with lots of people who are Middle Easterners working to try to achieve goals in their countries and region that are consonant with our objectives, who would be very happy to have small amounts of American assistance to do that and can't figure out how to get it.
Thank you. Did you want to briefly add to that? And then we'll go to this gentleman. I'm headed next.
Sure. Very briefly, since you brought up the issue of labels in schools, we did have a brief exchange on that, and I said I would be happy to be depicted as a liberal internationalist, thinking that you would have, on one hand, a naive, idealistic neoconservative, and then on the other, a cold-hearted, amoral realist. And I figured, to become this sort of sensible, pragmatic, that was fine with me, even though I do recall also saying that I'm uncomfortable in general with labels. I mean, none of us always want to play to type and sort of represent a school, and I think that's particularly true, or it's also true on this issue, where I think schools have changed. I mean, liberal internationalists probably after 9/11 were a little bit more neocon than they had been before, but then after the past 8 years are probably a lot more realist than they were before that, and they developed a healthy skepticism for the U.S. ability to transform the world in the way that they might have been tempted by in the wake of 9/11. Just one brief word on Iraq, because I think it's relevant to this topic of religion. I think what we're most guilty of in Iraq is not so much underestimating the power and importance of religion in Iraq as of nationalism and sectarianism. Ruth alluded to this before in saying that it's hard sometimes to distinguish whether there's a conflict that's a religious conflict or an ethnic conflict. But I think there, nationalism and just the sort of resentment of foreigners coming in from the outside, regardless of religion, would have been a major factor. And in terms of the internal clashes within Iraq, I really think it's ethnic and sectarian more than religious. I mean, just to take the Kurds, who are mostly Sunni, it's not as if they're therefore aligned with the Sunni because they're more comfortable religiously. It's an ethnic thing, and we were also guilty of underestimating that.
Okay, Ruth, I'm going to let you respond to the realist label in just a minute, if you would, and let's get this to the audience. We have a question here.
Stanley Kober, I'm a Georgetown alum now at the Cato Institute. I would like to dispute the premise here. We were interested in religion in the 1980s, but it wasn't promoting religious extremism, not religious freedom. Part of the problem we have now is we supported this extremism against the Soviet Union. Okay? Saudi Arabia was mentioned this morning. We encouraged the Saudis back then to fund religious schools, to turn out devout young men who would then go to fight the Soviets. We encouraged President Zia in Pakistan to take his country in a more extreme direction because we thought this would be better to confront the Soviets. It seems to me if we're going to have any credibility here, we have to examine our own responsibility. I'm not saying we have the only responsibility. But to the extent we are focusing on these issues of religious freedom now, it is in large part because of our promotion of religious extremism back then.
Ruth, did you want to comment on that? Or anyone else?
I might quarrel just with the choice of words. I certainly there's a great consciousness in law of armed conflict about the problem of unexploded munitions after the war is over, and in that sense, the same kind of zeal that may impel somebody to fight against the Soviets has an afterlife, and people can't just be, indeed, turned around with an on and off switch. So there I certainly agree with you. But it is hard to persuade Afghans to face Soviet helicopters and weaponry. So the great game is a difficult one to play. I mean, I just to go back to the prior point, I think that indeed, often more than religion, it is tribe and clan, ethnicity, sect. This is why the Brits were so cynical, if I may, in their use of anthropology. Malinowski and Levi Strauss were help them teach them to be good colonialists and divide and conquer and figure out who's really doing what to whom in Iran. On your point about self-castigation, lamentation, I guess one can do that. And always judge one's policy with a sense of moral modesty, but ain't much to do about it now, so I'm not sure it gets you very far.
I think that's just wrong. It's what's perfectly true is that after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. collaborated with the Saudis and with Pakistanis in supporting the Afghan mujahideen who eventually defeated the Soviets and eventually were instrumental in bringing down the Soviet Empire. Even if what you said were true, it still would have been worth doing. I mean, defeating Hitler brought us the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. So we had to go on to fight that battle next. We were in a pretty serious battle, and this was actually turned out to be a master stroke in that battle. But the reality is different from what you described. We did not have a large part in the promotion of religious extremism. In fact, the foreign fighters in Afghanistan, I think according to all serious, different from what you described. We did not have a large part in the promotion of religious extremism. In fact, the foreign fighters in Afghanistan, I think according to all serious...
his form of realism, which probably is reflected in his theology, if you push back far enough, but is he lifted up very much in schools of international relations and in this country any longer? I haven't done this in a while.
Phil?
Yeah, well, Niebuhr's making a comeback. I'm not sure it's necessary to link it to his theology. You can, but what's making a comeback is this notion that we shouldn't always assume that we will put our power to good and that others will see that we're putting our power to good. So I'm not sure that the theology is what's driving it or being embraced by everyone, but what I think a lot of foreign policy thinkers are embracing in the wake of an experiment during which, for 7 years, we actually thought we could use our tremendous power to transform the world, and we would be doing good, and we would be seen as doing good, and therefore we would do good. All the experience of finding that to be much more difficult than we had thought reminded us to go back and look at Niebuhr and how he warned us about just assuming that power doesn't corrupt, and in fact it does. And so in that sense, I think it's becoming quite relevant.
Okay. This gentleman here, Amanda, raise your hand, please, sir.
I'm Viren Prakash from India. I want to make the first proposition I want to put slightly differently, and then I would like to have your reaction, please. So long as the religion as an instrument was used by Britain first and as a loyal successor by America subsequently as the tool of power, politics or gaining power, there was no need to worry about it. They used it, the Churchillian conservatives used it in India by Bengal partition after they found that Hindu Muslims had become one in mutiny. And ever since then, we had the Roids and everything else. Fortunately, now the two countries are getting closer. Second time, after Balfour Declaration, the planting of Israel was also a religious instrument. And then I entirely agree with the gentleman there that America, as the successor of the British imperialism, when they use it, it's not a problem. Now that religion is being used against the West, so to say, everybody in the academic circle, everybody seems to have woken up. So I think it's not correct to say that 20th century did not use religion as an instrument of power in a quite widespread way. So I think that's where I would like to have reactions.
Okay. Any comments on that?
I'll just do I think Balfour Declaration, which is a fascinating topic, is complicated because the Brits wanted to protect the canal. They had Cyprus, but that wasn't quite enough. It was nationalism as well as religion. It takes on a very different coloration after the Second World War, obviously, with the, I think, outrageous failure of Britain to accommodate refugees from Europe, which I do think, in some ways I'm Goldhagen's Goldhagen, puts on the Brits some joint and several responsibility for what was not done by way of saving people. So yes, it certainly shows. I carefully did a seminar. I would never have dared do this in Columbia at SAIS this last semester on the legal and political problems of the Arab-Israeli peace process, and occasionally we'd use the phrase perfidious Albion to just note that Britain made many inconsistent promises to many people without telling them about each other. And that's certainly true, but at the same time, I do think it's more than religion. It's British strategic interests. It's a kind of traditional philo-Semitism of the Brits. It's the aftermath of World War II. So I'm just a little reluctant to lump all of these in one basket as instances of mistaken projection of religious zeal.
Phil Gordon?
I think it's important to clarify what we mean, or I'll just say what I mean when we say that religion didn't dominate geopolitics in the 20th century or previous century. That doesn't mean that there weren't religious people. And it doesn't mean that religion wasn't used in geopolitics in some of the ways you describe. It does mean a couple of things. One, it wasn't the driving factor in geopolitics. The main fault line of the world in the 20th century was just not about differences of religion. It wasn't the main factor. It was much more, to go back to our realist and other paradigms, about states and power and ideology. What we're also saying is that I completely agree with the premise that the great powers, Britain and then the United States afterwards, when necessary for this geopolitical struggle, manipulated and used religion when necessary and possible. But it didn't do so for religious reasons. It didn't do so out of a shared religious belief or its own religion. The people who were helping us bring down the Soviet Union and Afghanistan could have believed in Scientology or anything, and they would have been equally useful, and we would have been willing to do it out of geopolitical interests. So I think that's at least what I'm saying when I'm saying it wasn't the dominant or driving factor. I would also repeat the notion that it's nationalism and sectarianism that is just as important in these cases as any genuine individual religious belief. And then finally, on the Afghanistan point, which is related, but let me just come back to it. I think it is right to observe that we took advantage and manipulated religion in this geopolitical struggle. To say, however, that we created fundamentalist Islam, I think, vastly exaggerates what went on. We took advantage of something that already existed. I mean, Osama bin Laden had his inspiration years before the United States had even heard of Afghanistan. And he and many other Muslims were driven to extremism by a whole range of factors, some of which already existed and some of which exist now. It is true, I think, that the memory of bringing down a superpower, which is a fake memory, but they convinced themselves they did it, helped rally people later. And if you want to call that taking advantage of religion, fine. But there were a lot of other factors, including the repression in their own states and the failure of secular Arab nationalism that I described, that led a lot of Muslims to turn to fundamentalism long before Afghanistan, and would have continued to do so had Afghanistan not existed. Last point is, in my presentation, I talked about balancing different goals in U.S. foreign policy, and Afghanistan is a classic example of that. Even if one had been aware of potentially negative consequences in terms of Muslim extremism, it was viewed at the time that bringing down the Soviet Union was a pretty big deal and a pretty important interest, and those two important goals had to be balanced, and we know how we balanced them.
Okay. Josh, did you want to add anything to this? Let me exercise my second question, or ask my second question here. And I'd like to put it to all three of you. Maybe we can start with Ruth and come this way. Will the next administration adopt democracy promotion as part of its foreign policy? And if it does so, to what extent will religious freedom be important in this particular case that I'm going to give you? And that is, if it is true that the United States did not create or generate Islamic fundamentalism or Islamist terrorism, nevertheless it exists, can religious freedom play a role in a democracy promotion effort in which it empowers, for lack of a better term, moderate Muslims to speak out about their own religion within the public square in Afghanistan, for example, where Muslims have been prosecuted for blasphemy for doing so? This is a question of religious freedom, it seems to me. And is this, so first, point one, will democracy promotion be thrown overboard, or will it be embraced with a new name? And secondly, can religious freedom in this particular way play a part in advancing stable democracy, more than just one man, one vote, one time? Ruth?
Oh, goodness. Well, no naive version of any of these, obviously. But the question of how you strengthen tolerant and moderate voices in Islam is so difficult to answer from the outside. Simply enunciating a formal right of free speech in Kabul, good luck. Just because the kinds of retaliation that people can suffer are so outside our possible power of preventing. I mean, the one sad, radicalizing takeaway lesson of mine from the 1990s, frankly, long before George Bush or anything else, was Rwanda and Bosnia and the absolute incapacity of the United Nations or any multilateral force to do micro-policing. A radical mastectomy like Bosnia, where you slice it in half, maybe, but village-level protection of small enclaves of, call them Croats, Serbs, and Muslims in Bosnia from the security dilemma when they've already lashed at each other's throats. The UN doesn't do that, won't do it. So if words were shields, yes, certainly there's now a deep self-consciousness of sort of an awe of worrying about what you might unleash, of not understanding the social currents, of realizing that you were largely disqualified from the conversation surely by ignorance. I mean, if there were a way to amplify the voice of, gosh, a lot of the North Africans I know at the United Nations who are my occasionally difficult but brilliant colleague, Abdel Fattah Amour of Tunisia, who is the special rapporteur on religious freedom. People like that who I think carry with them in the minds of some younger folks the onus of somehow being un peu trop français, a little colonial, a little beguiled by Europe, but in fact represent this wonderfully rich Mediterranean civilization. If one could strengthen their voice, if you could find ways in which you could bring forward, again, moderate Muslim voices in France. But I guess my preachment typically is as much against the Europeans as in exhortation to the Muslims, because there's still not a single, not even one single member of the French National Assembly was Muslim. So I don't see how you trademark this new idea of liberal Unitarian Muslim of a European style when there's still almost entire segregation between the banlieue and the center of the conversation in Europe. But yes, I wouldn't reinvent Encounter magazine. I would have lots of money for education in the Middle East. I would, instead of having the Comintern or Islamintern, I would have an attempt to really counter, in a very focused way, the radicalizing message of violent Islam. But how to do it is really an art form.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll try to concisely answer your two questions. Will the next administration promote democracy? Yes. I mean, American administrations have always supported the principle of promoting democracy. So whether, if it's standing for individual freedom and press freedom and rule of law and taking active or somewhat active measures to do so, I think so. What it won't do, to the extent that the Bush administration was seen as sometimes valuing democracy to the point of requiring military regime change and speaking in terms of lofty rhetoric about ending tyranny, I think there will be a walking back from that. But it will be a walking back to a place where American administrations have always been, which is that they do support democracy, but they also realize they have to balance that with other competing interests, and that it's really hard to promote democracy, and I suspect the next administration will struggle with it, just in the same way that so many. But I don't think it'll be just sort of chucked out the window, even though clearly the American public's tolerance, if that's the right word, or enthusiasm for throwing a lot of resources and potentially even military power to do it, is not there anymore. Your second question about promoting moderate Muslims, that America will do too. And it's an interesting question. I just don't know the answer, whether that fits under the category of promoting religious freedom. If it does, then yes, I think America will do it. Because I think whoever gets elected as the next president will believe it to be important that moderate Muslim voices are heard, and will do what they can to promote that. But as I suggested in my opening remarks, I think that this correlation often works the other way. If we can generate more free and open democratic societies, religious freedom will result from that, rather than thinking somehow we can wedge the religion issue and in that way generate a more open and free society.
I disagree with Phil on one point in particular. I don't think it's right to say that promotion of democracy is something that America has always done. Because it has always done it, but Bush did something new, and it wasn't just to invade Iraq. That is, he said, he made one and then subsequent speeches in which he said, for 60 years, U.S. policy toward the Middle East has pursued stability. And whereas we were interested in promoting democracy at various moments in Eastern Europe, Latin America, we never applied that to the Middle East, and that was a mistake, and now we're going to apply it. And I think everyone in the region as well as here agreed that that was true, that this was a change. And I think you probably don't disagree with that.
No, I don't. But can I say, and that was a lovely speech. But in what fundamental ways did policy towards Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and so on change after that speech? That's the point I was trying to make, that's all.
Policy toward Egypt did change for a while. I mean, to have the Secretary of State go to Egypt and say the things she did, to have the President in the State of the Union single out Egypt by name, the great state of Egypt that led the Middle East in the field of peace, now needs to lead it in the field of democratization. I mean, that's quite a striking thing.
And getting Abraham Said out of jail, for example.
So I think, in fact, there was something new, and I think that something new will, in fact, continue in the next administration. And I make that a guess based on an extrapolation from what happened in the 1970s when President Carter raised human rights to a much higher salience in U.S. foreign policy. And if you, those who are old enough, if you think back, what he ran into was something vaguely analogous to what Bush ran into, which was there was a big pushback by various governments that were affected, both by the Soviets, who made the SALT negotiations hostage to the U.S. shutting up about human rights, and from a series of right-wing dictatorial allies of the U.S. who took great umbrage at our criticizing them. And much as Condi Rice now kept quiet the last time she went to Egypt, so the Carter administration pulled back to the point where the point person on that, who was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, Patricia Darien, resigned, and she gave an interview that was on the front page of the New York Times, telling how disillusioned she was with the administration's pullback from its human rights advocacy. And then when Reagan came in, he made a big deal about how human rights, initially he made a big deal that human rights was part of the broader fuzzy-headed liberalism of the Carter administration that was going to be done away with. And Al Haig, in his first press conference, said, "Combating terrorism will be our human rights policy," just to show how tough he was. And it took about a year, and the Reagan administration did a complete about-face and said, gee, and they came out with a white paper that said, not only is it false that we are putting less emphasis on human rights, in fact, human rights is the centerpiece of everything we're doing. And since then, human rights has remained an issue of the higher salience in U.S. foreign policy than it was before Jimmy Carter came along, because, in my estimation, because it has such resonance with the American public. My sense is that the idea that we should encourage democracy in the Middle East also has resonance with the American public, even though the war in Iraq no longer does. And I do agree with you, Phil, that there's not going to be a repetition of the war in Iraq, or that is, there's not going to be a repetition of trying to spread democracy by the sword. But I think operationally and rhetorically, the idea that one of the things we are trying to do vis-a-vis the Middle East is to democratize it is going to continue to be with whatever president, because I can't picture the speech in which the president says never mind about that. There's no way to present that to the American public that I can see. As far as religious freedom being a part of it, I do sort of agree in general what you said, Phil, about there's a broader issue which religious freedom is one part, but I do finally repeat the point I made before. The special thing about religious freedom is it does give us an ability to have a dialogue with the Muslim world that is very important, and when we have very few ways of entering into the discussion of how Islam should treat these things, but we can't tell them how they should interpret their scripture and tradition. But we can say, look, we want to talk to you about how you treat us, because you want to have a relationship with us. You want to come and do certain things in our country, so we would like to come and have certain freedoms in your country. And I think that does give us a certain wedge for getting into a discussion with the Islamic world that we don't have many other ways to enter.
Okay, I'm going to give Ruth the final word.
I just wanted to piggyback on this question just with one cautionary tale, too, which I don't think has gotten enough attention, and it's a very sad development because I do spend so much of my life in Geneva, which is that lately the evolution of this new Human Rights Council in Geneva that some people had high hopes for to replace the Human Rights Commission has been 50 steps backwards, 1 step forward, in which the atmosphere is so desultory, the rhetoric is so vile, the domination by the worst political elements of OIC countries using this for a hobby horse to maintain their own regimes in power has become so thick and undisplaceable, and which the High Commissioner herself, who's now leaving but may be replaced, has utterly given up the ghost. In fact, has joined in. The old joke among non-neocons or neocons is sometimes, even though John Bolton's against it, it's still the wrong thing to do. And this was one case in which there was an ocular displacement. The Human Rights Council was, as Newt Gingrich says, as George Mitchell said, as the New York Times said, a terrible mistake. Reform does not always bring you reform, and you use up your opportunity. And we're not paying much attention to it. And frankly, and here's where Josh is my pal, I think the American human rights groups with whom I'm either affiliated or friendly are so embarrassed by their naivete in having allowed this to happen because they don't understand UN politics, that they're even loath now to call a spade a spade. And it's really, Geneva has become a venue of anti-Semitism. Short and simple.
Please join me in thanking our guests.